Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. It's been great to see the speed with which a movement against Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza has arisen, and it's important that many people who are taking action are going beyond the absolutely necessary call for a ceasefire and naming the root of the problem as Zionist settler colonialism across the territory of historic Palestine. As people learn about settler colonialism, they may learn about how a century ago, a section of the British ruling class supported Zionism because they wanted, in the words of one of them, a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. In other words, they favored a Jewish state in Palestine that will be a reliable bastion for British imperialism in the region, similar to what in Ireland the Protestant-dominated counties loyal to the British state were in relation to the rest of Ireland at a time when most people in Ireland wanted to end British colonial rule. As people today learn about the history of Israel, they learn that the US backed its creation, as did the USSR, which too few people on the left know and understand. They learn how the US and other Western states have continued to support Israel's oppression of the Palestinians, even under its current government, the most right-wing in Israel's history. They learn that Joe Biden said that, to quote, if there was not an Israel, we'd have to invent one. And so they ask why. Of course, there's more than one explanation, but many people are rightly drawn to the idea that this Western support for Israel has to do with an unjust US-dominated global system, imperialism. And so many supporters of Palestine identify with opposition to imperialism, which is most welcome. Of course, this brings up the question of what is imperialism. Some people think about it just in terms of bad policies that are unjust towards the global south but could be changed. Other people think of it more in terms of a system of US domination or the domination of the world by the US and other Western states organized in NATO. However, these ways of understanding imperialism don't go far enough. They don't really grasp what it is. Now, on this podcast, Victor's Children, previous episodes have talked about imperialism, and I encourage interested listeners to check out episode 10 on imperialism, and also 3 episodes from the year 2023, episodes 31, 32, and 33. To put it briefly, though, I think we should understand imperialism as referring to how capitalism as a global system is organized in a hierarchy in a way that's to the greatest benefit of capital in the regions where capitalism is most developed. So there's a pyramid, and at the top of that pyramid is the US, the most dominant power. Below it, we can think of other imperialist states, including the UK, Germany, France, China, Russia, Canada, and Australia. Below them, there are sub-imperialist states, which have regional power, and in the bottom tier are most of the countries in the world. I think it's helpful to think about all of this in a way that Lenin called an imperialist chain. In other words, there's a hierarchy of states engaged in both economic and geopolitical competition. So if that's imperialism, what does it mean to be against imperialism? From what political perspective should we oppose it? How should we fight against imperialism? To talk about these things, I'm very happy today to have 2 guests joining me. Could you introduce yourselves? Maybe go from east to west.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ramah. I am a Syrian-American activist who lives right outside DC, born and raised in the Chicago suburbs. And I've long time done work in support of Palestinian rights, anti-war work, anti-Islamophobia work, and really excited to be part of this conversation.
And I'm Brian Bean, currently located in so-called Chicago from North Carolina originally. I'm part of the Tempest Socialist Collective, founding editor of Rampant Magazine, and I've done various organizing around imperialism and solidarity with Palestine, including collaborating on editing the book Palestine, A Socialist Introduction.
Okay, thank you. So to begin with, do you have any thoughts to share about the way of understanding imperialism that I've outlined, especially about the difference between just opposing particular government policies like support for Israel or perhaps Western multinational corporations, in the global south, and this other way of thinking about imperialism as a facet of capitalism?
Yeah, I appreciate you, opening up with that. And I think it's very important when we talk about imperialism today, just recognizing there is really one global economic system in place. And that is, as you mentioned, capitalism. Because many times I think, when people think about, well, the reason the US is imperialist versus, China and Russia not so much, in their mind, there's still some like misunderstanding that like these other nations are not capitalist, they're socialist, they're communist, whatever, propaganda is out there on that. And I think it's very important that we are clear there's one global capitalist system, and all of these nation states are benefiting from it tremendously. And they are looking for where they can exploit resources, where they can exploit labor. And many times that happens to be other smaller nation states, where folks can come in, again, steal the resources, or create treaties with governments that then give them cover to exploit resources under more politically acceptable ways, and all that. And I think once you start thinking about it that way, it becomes clear why we talk about multiple imperial powers. Why saying, well, what we actually need in the world is, people are pushing like we need a multipolar world, which is not necessarily the ideal alternative either. If all these multipolar powers are in fact seeking the same thing, domination of the world, and supposedly in competition with each other, but in the end, they're okay with actually being all exploitative together, if it ensures that their world order as it is, of them being in power and the rest of the world being subject to them, is it continues to be the way it is.
Yeah, I think that's an important perspective to have. And I think the other thing that is a component of that is that imperialism is not just the policy that's chosen by states, but it is a system rooted in economics that dictates the policies of states. And so Nikolai Bukharin, one of the sort of founders of one of the theories, writes that as war is nothing but the continuation of politics by other means, so is politics nothing but the method of the reproduction of certain conditions of production. And so that's how you get the situation that we have now, that is that of a hostile band of brothers, which is how Marx refers to it, where you have all these leaders of all these different countries who are fraternal in the sense where they're connected by this one system of capitalism. They go to all the same trade conferences and they have their negotiations at the same time that the nature of competition between different capitalist classes and different nations come in such fierce competition for profits that it breeds competition on the economic level, on up to, of course, the most egregious of those, which is war, which always comes at the cost of working class people around the world, not those of the rulers who, during the wars themselves, go and hobnob at conferences to decide trade deals at fancy conference centers and resorts around the world.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts then about what it means to be against imperialism, which is part of how capitalism is organized globally, and how that plays out in terms of some of the practical consequences if we're going to be consistently anti-imperialist, not just opposed to U.S. imperialism, although of course that's essential, or in the Canadian state against Canadian imperialism, but against imperialism in general in a consistent way?
Yeah, to me, I mean, I always start with the idea of, the basic idea of self-determination for people, and really giving people understanding that people themselves have agency, have the power to help determine what they want and need in this life, and how we, as folks who, maybe in solidarity with different people across the globe, think about how we can change the conditions in order for them to be able to succeed in what they're seeking out. So they are able to, again, fulfill what they want in their lives and what they feel the future of their lives are. I think what has been very, bothersome in the last 10, 15 years on these issues of imperialism, and what it means to be anti-imperialism, is the inability to see beyond a very US focused lens. And particularly for folks in the United States, where they themselves kind of practice their own like US exceptionalism of just like, well, the US is so evil that there is like some exceptional about the US, and no one else in the world can ever even reach that. And yes, in this current moment, the US has a lot of evil on its hands, but historically, it wasn't always the United States, and in the future, may not always be in the United States. So when we are fighting now against imperialism, how are we fighting it in a way that's not limiting what we need to do to actually be a free and liberated world across the globe. I don't want to replace the US imperialism with another form of imperialism. That's not my ideal. And then the reality is, I think sometimes folks get caught up in an ideology to the cost of what it means to how you interact with humanity. And again, as I mentioned, I myself, my family is from Syria, and I saw that a lot in the last 10 to 15 years around Syria of just, wait, Syria complicates the viewpoints and the worldview that some people have of the US being the number one evil in the world. And how can it be that in Syria, actually the US is not the number one evil party in the world? There are dozens of parties fighting in Syria, continue to fight in Syria, and frankly, the US is not the top problem in there. And so what does that mean then for us? Like, how can we reorient then in certain places where we need to step back from this idea that it's only the US that we need to concentrate on, and still understanding that, yeah, if we are in the US, there are particular things that we're going to be able to do because we are in the belly of the beast, the heart of empires, people like to say. But that cannot be done at the cost of understanding there is a larger framework at play. And it does not mean we can throw certain groups under the bus, whether it is Syrians, whether it's Uyghurs who are facing genocide by China, whether it's Ukraine and what they're facing with Russian occupation. How can we both balance we focus in on the US because we're in the US, but also in a way that doesn't undermine these other struggles. And where there are times that actually we know, just like we're saying, there's one system in place. So there are actually times where we do have power potentially over these other struggles, even when the US isn't the belligerent. Think about corporate power. Think about the weapons manufacturers, the surveillance companies that are not all US based, all profiting off of all these things. So I think when we limit ourselves to a framework of just US, we're really even limiting the amount, the power we have to actually shift and make change across struggles and movements.
Maybe I could just ask you one follow-up question, which for the benefit of listeners who may be new to some of these questions, who don't actually know anything about the history of Syria in the 21st century, could you give a really brief thumbnail summary of events since maybe 2010 or something like that in Syria, just in the most basic broad brush strokes to illustrate those points that you were just making?
Yeah, well, definitely. And I say also, I think it's important with what's happening in Palestine now to sometimes go back and actually figure that history out. Because, there is a continuing link between what's happening in Palestine, the continued existence of these oppressive Arab regimes, and how they feed off and help support the continued existence of Zionism in the region and what Israel continues to do to the Palestinian people. So we're coming up to the anniversary now of the start of what is known as the Arab Springs, what became known as the Arab Spring, the revolutions against Arab regimes that started in Tunisia in December of 2010. And then with a street vendor named Mohammed Bouazizi who set himself on fire, and that sparked protests across Tunisia for people demanding the fall of the regime. And those protests then spread to Libya, they spread to Bahrain, they spread to Egypt, they spread to Syria, they spread to Yemen, and all across the region. And in Syria particularly, those protests, again, demanding the fall of the regime, started in the March of 2011, and were quickly met by extreme violence by the regime, who really wanted to shut down. This is a regime who, at the helm is Bashar al-Assad, who inherited power from his father, Hafez al-Assad. They've been in power for decades now, the Assad family. And the regime retaliated in most horrific ways to protests that were, involved things that we are familiar with, strikes and sit-ins and protests and very creative and beautiful ways of chants and artwork and street theater. And slowly, in reaction to the violence from the regime, some folks took up arms, and it became more violent. Then we had counter-revolutionary forces step in as well, both in support of the Assad regime, like Russia, like Iran, but as well as counter-revolutionary armed groups, such as Al-Qaeda and Daesh. And the revolution, till this, many people have been killed. The UN stopped counting at 500,000 many, many years ago. So the numbers are probably much higher now. the regime has politically disappeared many tens of thousands of people, millions and millions of refugees across the region, and millions more internally displaced. And in this moment, the regime has retaken control of much of the country, minus the northwest part, an area called Idlib that contains a lot of internally displaced people from different parts of Syria. Actually, the regime and Russia have used the attention on Israel's genocide of Gaza to increase their airstrikes in Idlib, recently killing, I think the last number was like 200 people in the last couple of months. And so it's tragic that this is where we have gotten in Syria, but also protests continue to happen against the regime. So I think that is very important that 13 years in and all this violence, protests continue to happen in Idlib, protests continue to happen in Sweda over the last couple of weeks, which is actually a very, which historically is a region with the Druze minority, which many people assume are just automatically pro-regime. And yet they themselves are now taking to the streets and demanding the fall of the regime. And so, I think that's where the hope continues to be, of just like, even after all of this violence and so many different parties involved in Syria right now, that the core values and demands of the revolution we continue to hear from people on the ground. And one last thing I'll say is just like, especially, we've also seen people take to the streets in solidarity with Gaza, especially in Idlib, where people are like, yes, we have bombs falling on our head, and that's actually why we feel we need to take to the streets and be in solidarity with the folks who are facing the Israeli bombs in Gaza.
Right, and just to tie it back to what we were talking about before, the intervention of the Russian state in support of the Syrian state was crucial in keeping it going. And although some people on the left, in the West, claimed that the U.S. really wanted regime change in Syria, I think they were much more interested in getting rid of, the president. They probably wanted to get rid of Assad, but they certainly didn't want to get rid of the regime because of the role that it plays in the region. So that's just something to bear in mind if people are hearing some of the kind of easy answer one-liners that you sometimes hear about Syria from some people on the left. Brian, did you want to come in on anything else about the thinking about these questions and the practical consequences of consistent anti-imperialism?
I mean, I think I would just add more to what Ramah was talking about as far as how it limits our politics, because what it often does in its application is, if you don't have consistent anti-imperialist politics, then you are asking people who are wanting to be involved in organizing around, say, something like the war in Iraq. And if you see the world as two opposing camps and not as the system of imperialism as we're describing it, then it means that you have to defend the sort of current enemy of the state that you're in. And so it says that, well, no, you can't just oppose the U.S. war in Iraq, but you have to oppose the war in Iraq and advocate for Saddam Hussein or whatever despot else is around there. And it just raises the platform of how you're trying to talk to and engage regular people and asking them to agree with authoritarian regimes that harshly repress other folks. And I think essentially what it's about is, who is your ally? And, the main driver of global competition right now is between the U.S. as the major power and China. And that competition has tremendous economic impacts on working people of the world. It has ripples of military sort of consequences, and it continues. The saber rattling in the South China Sea continues to increase. And so, in this context, who are the allies of people, working class people in the United States? And I think that we should firmly say it's the working people of China. It's not the China as a whole, but it's saying, hey, we think that if we rose up and got rid of our state and they did the same, then that's how we actually break this cycle of competition driven by the drive for profit that fuels capitalist competition and fuels the potentiality of war and violence across the globe.
Right. So I think this brings us to just clarifying that we're talking about a kind of anti-imperialism which says, yes, the main enemy is at home where we are, but it's consistent opposition to all forms of imperialism. And that's different from another outlook that you find on the left, which has a kind of enemy of my enemy is my friend approach. The kind that there's this kind of politics which says that China and Russia aren't imperialist and has an either uncritical or not very critical attitude to those states, and to basically any other state that might be in conflict with the US, whether that be Iran, Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, you name it. Some people call this anti-NATO campism, or just campism for short. Could you just say a few more words about that kind of politics, which I think has become more influential on the left than it once was?
Yeah, 2 points I would respond to that. One, I think again, like who gets to decide who is my enemy and who is not. So sure, for many Americans, maybe China is not top on their head of their enemy, or Russia is not on the top of their head of their enemy, right? I, as someone who has family in Syria, sorry, Putin is my enemy. I'm not gonna deny, like, you can't tell me that, well, he's not your enemy because he's not attacking you in the US. He's attacking my family in Syria. And that's just, I'm not gonna be like, have to choose who is the worst for me, Putin or whatever current US president is. They're both my enemies. They're both attacking me and my family and putting us in danger. Second, I think that, again, that question of like, sure, technically they're claiming to be enemies, but are they really enemies? And again, it goes back to like who's benefiting from the current world order, who's benefiting from the status quo, who's gonna lose out if we actually build the world we want to see, where people are put first, where corporations aren't plundering everything in order to line up their pockets, in support with full support by various governments. And one category, a framework I tell people to think about is, since the launch of the global war on terror, now 20 plus years in, where we have seen time and time again, different states use the framework of terrorism and fighting terrorism in order to make clear that they can do whatever they want. And everyone is doing this. It's the United States, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Iran, it's China, it's Russia, state after state after state, India, when Kashmir, Turkey, and when they go after Kurdish folks, like again and again, we see this idea of these states learning from each other, sharing kind of like lessons learned, even if it's not officially in meetings, but also maybe even in meetings, how they can collectively repress people demanding their rights across borders, across struggles, across movements. And so again, I would push people to think about like, they're not seeing each other as enemies. Again, the big talk, yes, and yes, there's competition because they all want to line their pockets. But if you're going to tell them are you all enemies to each other, or are you seeing the people as your enemies? They're going to say the people. And we need to be very clear then that collectively as people, we need to take on these powers together.
So true. So true. I think the other thing about just the notion of campism is it's almost like a strange carnival looking glass. So campism came out of post-World War II politics from Stalin, in which, to justify the fact that now Stalin was trying to consolidate a socialism in one country, they had abandoned the Comintern, so abandoned the idea that they would push for socialist revolution around the world. And so to justify that, said, well, there's actually two camps. There's that of the anti-imperial camp, the democratic camp, which is the countries that were allied with the Soviet Union, and that they're allied with the United States. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, I mean, only the most myopic of individuals would not call Russia a capitalist state. But still, the kind of notion of campism is inherited and just continues to play the fine line. So another example is the so-called World Peace Council, is an organization that was started in 1949 by Stalin. It continues to be sponsored by Russia under the Putin regime. And one of the things they did was these observers that would go to Syria and provide, eyewitness propaganda on behalf of the Assad regime. And so the very fact that things like the World Peace Council that were started to justify Stalin's sort of control of the Soviet Union and the world has continued uninterrupted, that it was in favor of the peaceful tanks invading Hungary in 1956, that it was in favor of the peaceful invasion of Afghanistan. I'm giving a scare quotes over that for our listeners. There's no notion of peace. And so it's a looking glass mirror where there's nothing democratic about Russia. There's nothing democratic about China. In the same way, there's nothing democratic about the United States. But this inheritor of the notion of there's two camps of the world actually doesn't make any sense if you know anything about global politics, but they're still regurgitated to back despots like Bashar al-Assad or the Iranian regime or Putin or a whole number of them, and are then on the flip side used to reinforce the notion that somehow Biden is on the side of democracy, which of course is absurd. And looking at his defense of Israel's genocidal actions are similar. There aren't a democratic forces and there's not undemocratic forces. There's one undemocratic force, which is the world's capitalist states, and they have shades of difference, they have shades of agreement, they have shades of conflict, but in the end, it's always working class people around the world, especially folks in the global south who receive the short end of that violent stick.
Right. So our kind of opposition to imperialism, which we can, anti-imperialism, it's consistent. It says neither Washington nor Beijing, for example. It's an internationalist politics, right? It's what some people have called an internationalism from below. So what do you understand by that idea of an internationalism from below?
Yeah, I think about principles of solidarity. I think about principles of people have agency outside of these powers. I think one thing that we struggled a lot with when we were trying to, get folks to understand why Syria was so important was people just could not get beyond the geopolitics of it all. It was just like, well, it's these global powers are fighting each other and like we just need to be against the war. And it's like, okay, yeah, fine. Against war is fine, but like you're not actually listening to what Syrians are demanding, why they rose up, what they need in this moment. Why are we not respecting the fact that they know what they need in order to accomplish their own freedom and their own liberation? And I think that's when I think about internationalism from below, it's really centering, again, like we were saying, people over states. It's really being aware of the geopolitics. Geopolitics obviously are important. We need to be aware of who is profiting, who is benefiting from all of this, but it cannot be at the expense of understanding the powerful daily acts people are doing on every single day in order to build the better world for themselves as well. Because if you get lost in the geopolitics, there's a lot of not hope in that. The hope comes from what people are doing every single day. And I think that's very important. And then again, that concept of like internationalism makes you then have to look at every situation and understand every situation on its own while making connections, while seeing similarities, while drawing the important connections that we need to do. But at times when we talk about, two forces against each other, or when we talk about, again, the geopolitics of it, we just pretend, okay, well, yeah, all those folks in that region, they're all dealing with the same thing. So Syria is Iraq, is Libya. And now, like, there's so many different nuances of all of these places. You can't just lump them all together. You can analyze in a similar frameworks. Of course, that's important. But when you just claim that they're the same, it leads to a miseducation of what's actually happening. And then if we don't actually know what's happening, then how can we figure out what our role is to play in support wherever we may be, whether we're there on the ground, whether we're here in the United States, or whatever part of the world we are fighting from.
Yeah, I think it speaks to, I think, one of the just most important tenets of Marxism, which is that socialism has to come from the self-emancipation of the working class. And I think internationalism from below is that same thing. It's like we have to understand that liberation will only be achieved by the self-emancipation of working, struggling people around the globe by themselves. And that's a very different lens than I think through Ramah, like you were saying, like you have to figure out all the mechanics of global politics, which is important when you get to the level of strategy and tactics and all that sort of stuff. But as a principle, I think we want to put forward that internationalism from below is the understanding that democracy, liberation, anything that with the strand of progressivism has to be brought about by the self-emancipation of the masses. And I think that thinking about Palestine right now is a really good indicator of that. And so you think about some of the narratives about how we are going to liberate Palestine or stop the immediate genocide. And some of it flow through, we need to depend upon Iran to help give the military support, or Hezbollah is going to carry out some military action, or the Saudis are going to step in and negotiate stuff. And like that is such just a shadow of what it would take. Rather, I think we do see the hope of what that internationalism from below would look like with the massive demonstrations in the Arab world. I think we see shadows of what that would look like with the Egyptians entering the streets of Egypt, despite the fact that pretty much all protest is illegalized, and marched to Tahrir Square for the first time in 10 years in solidarity with the Palestinians against Sisi, who is the other jailer. And so I think that the internationalists from below are those folks in the streets from below who are oftentimes the same people who are rising up against their own governments as they're our allies. And I think that what the engine is, who our allies are in emancipatory struggle, and seeing that as those forces from below, I think is just so essential and exemplifies what it means to be internationalism from below.
Well, then maybe let's move from those important points to talk about, an unfortunate reality that's part of the world today, which is that there are lots of situations where there are forces fighting against imperialism or against the state backed by imperialism, but they're under right-wing leadership. So, for example, in Ukraine, there's a government which is waging a defensive war against Russian imperialism, a war that's at the same time caught up in an inter-imperialist rivalry between the West and Russia. But the Ukrainian government is committed to neoliberal capitalism. It would like to join NATO and the European Union. And although the Russian state and anti-NATO campists exaggerate the strength of the far right, Ukrainian nationalists in Ukraine, those forces are real, as Ukrainian leftists make very clear to us. And in a very different situation in Palestine, you have Hamas, which is the strongest political force, I think, among people opposed to settler colonialism and as well opposed to the Palestinian Authority, which collaborates with Israeli settler colonialism. But Hamas's Islamist politics are conservative, and it seeks to ally with the rulers of the Gulf states, Turkey and Iran, as Palestinian socialists and feminists know very well. So for those of us who are supporters of our kind of anti-imperialism in countries like the US, Canada, and the UK, where most of the listeners to this show are, how do we deal with this reality about situations where you do have forces that are in conflict with imperialism but under right-wing leadership?
Yeah, a very big question that does not have simple answers. So I tend to think of it of just like, okay, what are the principles and the values that we want to uphold? And how do we both recognize the right of people to resist, the right of people to self-defense, and also understanding that not everyone necessarily who is taking up arms is an emancipatory force, is a liberatory force. And I think, and again, that's where this nuance is so important, and why, again, it's more complicated than like two campus and let's fight it out. We need to really think through and think about and again, I'll use Syria as like another kind of example here, because a lot of what folks would say when we'd be like, Syrians need your solidarity, and they'd be like, what does this mean, solidarity? Are you telling us to be in solidarity with these, very violent armed groups? Are you telling us to be in solidarity with these very counter-revolutionary forces? Are you telling us to be in solidarity with Al-Qaeda, with Daesh? All of this like ridiculous things that would come up and be like, no, I said be in solidarity with the Syrian people's struggle. They're very clear what they've been demanding and going out in the street and demanding. And if you actually paid attention to Syria, you would notice that when folks started taking up arms, there was a lot of conversations among Syrian revolutionaries of, is this actually what we need? Is this what's going to happen actually in reaction to this? And then even folks who supported, well, we need self-defense, we're also very clear, well, if the armed groups do not continue to follow the values of what we are as a revolution, we are going to protest against them. And that happens. That has happened, especially in Idlib, where Idlib has been under control by forces that are not necessarily showcasing the power of what the revolution wanted. And people have come out and protested against that. And I think that's, again, where when we talk about the need to focus in really on the people power, and at some point, it may include people who have taken up arms. I'm not someone who will tell people they do not have a right to self-defense. They do not have a right to that resistance. I think that is an important part of struggles as well. But when that happens, are we not losing the bigger sight towards we have principles that we want to build on? We are trying to build a better world. And I'm someone I will also say I am anti-militarist. So there is a tension there. And it's okay, I think, to be tension. Again, people want very simple, like, just tell me who I'm against or I'm for. And yes, there are very clear examples sometimes of that. Here are the oppressed people. Here are not the oppressed. But then as we're building a better world, we have to engage, I think, in more nuance and be very clear that the world we're building is one where there is liberation for all. There is freedom for all, even if that means having to take on people who supposedly are resisting in the name of our struggles.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, like how not to simplify it is hard. But I think what we're trying to avoid is, I think, two possible hurdles. One, particularly in thinking about the question of Hamas and currently, is to just say, well, the role of people who are progressive, left, socialists outside of Palestine, we have to condemn Hamas because there are conservative elements of it or whatever. The main thing we have to do is condemn Hamas and really sort of push that away. I think the other pole to avoid is one to completely uncritically just say they are the leadership and everything goes and whatnot. I think in the middle, this is where the stuff that Ramah is talking about gets a lot more complicated. But I think that it's also in some ways not complicated. I think it's always on the side of the oppressed. It is saying, yes, I think that people have a right to resist, and I think that resistance against Israeli soldiers right now is something that's happening, and I think that that's important that we defend people's right to do that. I think at the same time that we recognize that in Palestine, while the various resistance factions, the Al-Qassam brigades and whatnot, are very popular, that doesn't mean that people have political allegiance to Hamas as a political body, and that a lot of the sort of the gist of Palestinian politics is going beyond some of the old political factions. And I think our idea is that we want to try to build bridges of solidarity with the folks who are trying to make those connections, trying to sort of forge alternatives in a way that aren't sort of sectarian to the immediate sort of demands of the day, and trying to chart a way through that. And as Ramah said, it's quite complicated in some ways because you have to figure out the sort of current context, the current conjecture, and then what you say about it at the same time that is very simple, in which one should always be on the side of the oppressed, and avoid those two poles of just being a critical person from without and not understanding that there's oppressor and the oppressed, and not just cheerleading various political groupings that we may have disagreements with, and that those disagreements occur in conversation with, connection with, and collaboration with actual people on the ground, actual Palestinians who have a say, and not just doing so sitting in one's couch, being a Monday morning quarterback for resistance movements in countries that you are not.
If I can just add one more thing here too. I do think we spend a lot of time digging into this is what the problematics of some leftist folks thinking on these global affairs. And what's been very frustrating with what's been happening the last 2 months is the liberal take on what's happening on Palestine, and how much harder it makes it then for us on the left to be like, this is actually why we have problems with you all saying, we're gonna, obviously we're pro-Russia or pro-China or whatever kind of campy stuff campism is happening there, because people will just be like, oh, see, these folks are right about everything about the liberals. And I think that's where that liberal hypocrisy makes it so much harder. I remember, again, Syria as an example, but Ukraine, when Russia invaded Ukraine, a year and a half ago, and people were like, see the hypocrisy of the Western world and how they're how they're welcoming to Ukrainian refugees, and everyone wants to boycott Russia, and here's all the weapons going to Ukraine. And I'm like, I understand it all. And also, how do we use this and as the example of actually how the world potentially should respond to these types of things? And then a year and a half later, it's all up in our face that actually it's all, it's all based on racism. It's all based on, US interests and Western interests and all of that. And that makes it so much more difficult for us to be able to pull people away from the ideologies that we find problematic on the left, because they're like, well, they were right about anything, and they have a point. They are right about liberal hypocrisy. They are right that Palestine is not going to get the same support that Ukraine is getting. And so I think there's like that angle of things that like have been also frustrating in recent weeks, as it's just like, y'all, like we're trying to get people to understand that you should be against occupation everywhere. You should be against imperialism everywhere. And then the liberal hypocrisy comes up, and it just makes it even more difficult to then organize around these things, and make people better understand like why potentially, people getting arms from the US governments, whether in Syria and Ukraine, is a necessity for these people and does not make them pawns of US imperialism. Or again, to have more of the nuanced conversations of like, yes, we wish everyone was treated like Ukrainian refugees, doesn't mean Ukrainian refugees shouldn't get the treatment they did get. That's great. That should set the example of the world. And I think that's like, continuing to push on these, like when people are understanding these hypocrisies, to be like, yeah, that's why we need to build on our better worldview that takes into consideration all of these things.
And just to wrap up on this point, I just think we can't underline too heavily the importance of making the distinction that you've been making. On the one hand, we're in unconditional solidarity with all struggles against imperialism and against settler colonialism, and that includes the right to armed resistance among the oppressed, right? But that is actually completely different from the idea of giving political support to a specific political force that's involved in that struggle among the oppressed. And we can make that distinction. And also we can make another distinction, which is to say, even when a political force that we strongly disagree with among an oppressed people is when it's in a military conflict, for example, fighting against Israeli tanks, you can say we're not neutral in that situation, right? We favor a military victory for the oppressed, even when we actually strongly disagree with the politics of the leadership in that situation. So we can make those distinctions. We just have to take the time to explain these things. Mindful of the time, I just wanted to bring us to one last question before we wrap up. And that is, when we think about the vision that inspires us as supporters of internationalism from below and consistent anti-imperialism, I think we have a vision of universal human freedom that's really at the core of these politics. So could you just share any thoughts you have about that, about our vision and what we ultimately seek to achieve through our opposition to imperialism?
Yeah, I mean, I think about, what inspires me a lot is just like, wanting to make sure everyone in the world has what they need in order to accomplish what they want in life, and I think so much again of what the world order is currently is about extraction, is about lining the pockets of a few, is about keeping, certain states powerful over the rest of the globe, just completely the opposite of like what I imagine of freedom. And I think it's important too to think about like how these issues of internationalism also come back, home, and the vice versa of that. So like, it's not coincidence that the Senate is currently going to be taking up a bill that both increases military funding, to Ukraine, to Israel, but also increases border militarization. And I think that's where, to me, I have hope of people being like, no, actually, we don't want to fund, this type of militarization that like both kills people at our border and then kills people in Gaza. Like, like this is not what we want. We want a world where people are able to travel freely, and there is no fear of militarism. There is no fear of borders, and people are able to get what they need, and see their loved ones and see their families, and are free from all of these kind of various systems that imprison us, including the prisons themselves. And I think, just holding on to that is so important, because it then makes you also understand like all people, like we need, again, that solidarity with all people, because we want all people to have these opportunities to live and yeah. And I think that's again the power of what we're seeing now, as folks are taking to the streets in support of Palestine. It forces people to talk about other struggles too. Like I think, and that's where I think, someone who's done Palestine work for, a decade now, it's been very powerful to see that of what actually opens you up, what it opens up for people when they take on Palestine. And that's such the opposite of what, like, in more liberal circles, they're like, no, we can't touch it because, like, who knows we're going to get shut down, we're going to be repressed, which is all real. Like the censorship and the repression is very real. but I also think it opens us up to think about things globally, and to think about even all the different powers that, again, like we said, are benefiting from oppression all over the globe.
Yeah, I think there's like three things that I would say about that. And I mean, the first is just go back to the notion of imperialism. And I always have a bad habit, perhaps, of quoting people like Lenin and Bukharin, but I'm going to do it now anyway. That Bukharin talks about that in order to end imperialism, he says the place of the idea of defending or extending the boundaries of the bourgeois state that bind the productive forces of world economy hand and foot. This power advances the slogan of abolishing state boundaries and merging all the people into one socialist family. And so I think that like the ending of imperialism is that very thing, abolishing state boundaries and merging all the people into one socialist family, and allowing for that kind of self-determination and the ability to be able to choose what you want and to have the resources to do that, just like Ramah was saying. And I think that the current Palestine protests really show that so much, because you have so many people who are so involved out in the streets, particularly in the US, that I think is probably the biggest mobilization, the biggest movement against US imperialism since the war in Iraq. But it's one in which US boots aren't on the ground. So the element of solidarity is even more profound, because people see the connections, even though it's not like directly US troops are carrying it out. It's really close to that, but it's not direct that people are still coming out multiple times a week in so many cities and getting arrested and risking all these things out of the sense of solidarity is so palpable. For me, when you ask the question, one thing that I thought of from my own experience that I'll just kind of close is, I remember when the Egyptian Revolution was happening. At the same time, there was an occupation of the Wisconsin state capitol. And I remember being at the Wisconsin state capitol and participating there and protesting and occupying against the Republican legislation to institute anti-union legislation. And I got this like text message that was a picture of a banner in Tahrir Square that said, "Tahrir stands with Wisconsin, one world, one pain." And like that sense of I'm struggling here and you're struggling there, and they're kind of about different things, but they're part of the shared fight for self-determination, for liberation and freedom that can merge all peoples into one socialist family, is really, I think, how I would articulate it.
Ramah, Brian, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.